4:30 a.m. January 9th, 2026. The outskirts of Lviv shudder. Russia has just launched an Oreshnik, a hypersonic weapon worth tens of millions of dollars, one that Moscow boasts is impossible to intercept. In the Kremlin's mind, this was a message, one strike to intimidate Western Europe. Proof that Russia is still strong even after losing a precious Oreshnik battery in Belarus just 4 days earlier. But Moscow is about to learn a brutally expensive lesson. Before the dust has even settled over Lviv, Ukraine strikes back. Two F-16 beasts punch a corridor through the sky in a storm shadow attack no one in Moscow saw coming. Now you need to understand the mindset in Moscow at the moment. To them, the Oreshnik is the Ferrari of the missile world, flashy, expensive, and something they love to brag about at the dinner table. But here's the catch: when you're buried under heavy sanctions, your high-end garage starts looking pretty empty. Just 4 days earlier, on January 5th, Ukraine managed to compromise an entire Oreshnik battery stationed in Belarus structurally. We're talking 10 launchers and billions of dollars in hardware turned into a localized thermal event before the crews could even finish their morning coffee. The Kremlin was feeling the heat. They were desperate for a demonstration of capability. They needed to look like a superpower again before any talk of a ceasefire hit the table. So they gathered their dwindling stockpile for one massive, expensive warning shot. On the night of January 8th, they initiated a large-scale engagement, 242 drones, 36 traditional missiles, and the centerpiece, the hypersonic Oreshnik. The target was Lviv, a city sitting just 40 miles from the NATO border. It wasn't just an infrastructure engagement, it was a loud, high-stakes signal sent directly to the west. On paper, the Oreshnik is a beast Mach 10 Velocity 6 MIRV warheads and a claim of being completely unprecedented. However, the actual impact told a different story. All that high-tech noise only managed to trigger a few automated gas safety sensors and cause minor structural compromise to the local grid. It was a multi-million-dollar firecracker that barely scratched the paint. But while the Russian commanders were busy patting themselves on the back for their hypersonic victory, they missed the most important detail Ukraine wasn't hiding. They were already initiating a counter-engagement that would make Moscow's expensive strike look like a minor accounting error. By 11:30 p.m., while the smoke was still rising in Lviv, the Ukrainian command didn't reach for a red phone to complain. They reached for the launch codes. This was a high-speed counter-engagement. The strategy, something the SBU calls silent shadow decoy, and it's a masterclass in making your opponent look like they've got more money than sense. Picture this: 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The Russian operators inside their Panzer S-1 vehicles are shivering their breath, fogging up the glass as they try to keep the heaters running. Then, the silence of the frozen night is shattered. From the Ukrainian side, 15 Luti drones roar to life. They are carbon fiber flying lawnmowers with one mission: to be as loud and annoying as possible on Russian radar. They drop down to 150 feet, skimming the icy power lines, their wooden propellers thrumming a low-pitched death song across the border. Inside the Russian command vehicle, the green radar sweep suddenly turns into a frantic strobing red. The operator's eyes go wide. He's not thinking about strategy. He's thinking, if I miss these, I'm going to a gulag. He slams the safety cover off the launch button. The Panzer's hydraulic turret slews 90 degrees in a fraction of a second, the dual 30mm cannons pointing their snouts into the black sky. Fire! The darkness is ripped apart by a white-hot flash. A $2 million interceptor missile screams off the rail, trailing a spiral of orange fire that lights up the snow-covered fields for miles. It's accelerating to Mach 2, chasing a drone that costs less than the missile's own guidance chip. Then the impact. A massive fireball erupts in the sky. To the Russian operator, it's a beautiful sight. He sees the target destroyed message and probably thinks he just saved the motherland. He watches the flaming debris of the Lyuti fall like burning confetti into the woods. In the Russian bunkers, they're cheering, they're high-fiving. But back in Kiev, the mission commanders are checking their watches and smiling, because every time a Russian Panzer fires, its missile tubes go empty. It takes 45 minutes of frantic, finger-freezing labor to reload those tubes. As the Russians celebrate their victories over the decoys, their radar screens are starting to ghost. The systems are overloaded, trying to process 10 different targets at once. The eye of the Russian defense is blinking, blinded by its own success. And that is exactly when the trap door opens. The bouncer has just emptied his gun at a shadow, and he hasn't even noticed that the real heavyweight is already breathing down his neck. Just when the Russian crews were lighting up victory cigars, thinking they'd swatted away a desperate drone swarm, the big beasts entered the chat. Two F-16 Block 70-72s, the Vipers, were loitering just inside Ukrainian airspace, teeth bared and ready to turn a victory into a strategic nightmare. This is what we call a Wild Weasel mission, and it's about as high drama as it gets. Up north near the Belgorod sector, the first F-16 pilot call sign Wild Weasel doesn't dive into the line. He doesn't have to. He releases the MAL-J. Now think of the MAL-J as a high-tech prank call. It's a small decoy that can mimic the radar signature of a whole squadron of B-52 bombers. Inside the Russian Panzer command vehicle, the operator's heart nearly stops. 1 second he's laughing at drones, the next his screen shows a massive formation of heavy American bombers inbound at high altitude. Contact B-52's multiple targets. The Russian operator slams his palm onto the launch button. He launches every single SAM tube he has. He's emptying the rack, firing millions of dollars into the clouds at ghosts. But while he's busy reloading a back-breaking 45-minute job in the freezing mud, the F-16 pilot smiles. He's been waiting for that Russian radar to scream. The moment the Panzer locks onto the decoys, the F-16 lets loose the AGM-88 Harm. This missile is a radar-hunting shark. It doesn't need a map. It just smells the Russian radar frequency and rides that beam right down the operator's throat. Inside the cockpit, the pilot feels the aircraft buck. The radar warning receiver is screaming a lock-on tone. He yanks the stick, pulling 9 Gs, his vision narrowing as the world turns gray from the pressure. He's evading a SAM while his own shark is closing in. The Harm impacts. It doesn't just hit the Panzer, it neutralizes the radar array, turning that multi-million-dollar shield into a blind, sparking hunk of metal. The Russian operator, now totally blind, resorts to his 30mm cannons. He's firing blindly into the sky, creating a wall of lead like a scene from an old war movie. It's desperate, it's loud, and it's completely useless. Meanwhile, to the south, near Oriol F-16, Sniper South is pulling the exact same trick. 2 ghost squadrons appear simultaneously from 2 different directions. The Russian High Command is having a collective meltdown. They think they're facing a large-scale engagement from the entire NATO playbook. Their systems are at 100% capacity. They are overwhelmed, overprocessed, and out of ammo. The cockpit display in the F-16 flashes T-minus 60 seconds. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the technology changing the face of war, hit that subscribe button now. The pilot levels off his heart, hammering against his ribs. He's done his job. He's kicked the door open and broken the bouncer's glasses. And through that open door, the silent shadows, the storm shadows, are already skimming the ground at 500 knots, their infrared eyes locked onto the heart of Russia's energy grid. But don't think for a second that the Russians just rolled over and played dead. These are crews trained for high-intensity engagements, and when their high-tech radar screens went dark or started screaming with ghost signals, they did what any battle-hardened operator would do. They went old school. The Russian commanders, realizing their automated systems were being rootkitted by Ukrainian electronic warfare, screamed the order over the secure lines, manual mode switched to optical. This is where the fight gets gritty. Since the Harm missiles had effectively blinded the radar eyes of the Panzer and Tor systems, the crews stopped trusting the computers. They switched to their electro-optical tracking, essentially a high-powered thermal TV camera and a manual joystick. They weren't looking for radar blips anymore. They were looking for heat signatures in the freezing 5-degree air. On the outskirts of Belgorod, a Russian operator, his hands shaking from the cold, and the adrenaline locks his thermal sight onto a flickering shape in the distance. He doesn't wait for a computer lock tone. He grabs the manual triggers of the dual 30mm autocannons. Fire everything! The night sky over the power plant turns into a scene from a sci-fi nightmare. Thousands of rounds of high-explosive tracer fire pump into the air at 2,000 rounds per minute, creating a wall of lead. It's like a laser light show, but every 5th light is a projectile the size of a beer bottle moving at twice the speed of sound. And for a moment, it looks like it's working. One of the Liuti decoys trying to skim a tree line is caught in a burst of 30mm fire. It disintegrates into a spectacular orange fireball. In another sector, a MAL decoy is shredded by a manual SAM launch. The Russian bunkers erupt in cheers. They think they've survived the boss fight. They think they've successfully defended the core. To them, the sky looks clear. They've neutralized the threats they can see. But here is the reality check that Moscow missed. While they were busy high-fiving over the ghosts they shot down with manual fire, they had ignored the most dangerous player on the board. Now, don't think for a second that this was just a Viper show. While those F-16s were busy dancing with Russian radars and playing the world's deadliest game of now you see me, now you don't, the real muscle was moving in behind them. They wouldn't risk their talented pilots. They used 2 separate flights of Su-24 fencers, the heavy-lifting Cold War tractors of the Ukrainian fleet. These guys didn't even need to cross the border. They stayed 250 miles back in friendly skies because when you're carrying a storm shadow, you don't need to get close to the fire to start a blaze. With a definitive heavy clunk, the storm shadows and scalps detached from their pylons. These aren't just missiles, folks. They're $2 million silent shadows with a grudge. Down on the ground, the Russian defense was a total mess. The Panzer operators were screaming, their radars flickering as they tried to recover from the F-16's electronic shouting. One Russian operator finally managed to reboot his system. He saw a clean blip, a real contact moving at 500 knots just 50 feet off the ground. Target acquired, fire. He slammed his joystick, sending a wall of 30mm lead into the sky. But it was like trying to catch a ghost with a butterfly net. The Storm Shadow doesn't fly like a drone. It's a stealthy predator that uses its imaging infrared seeker to see the target just like a human eye. It ghosted right through that wall of lead, weaving through the industrial landscape of Oriole, the first target. The Russian operator's breath comes in ragged gasps, his thermal monitor strobing as he desperately slews the turret. He's fighting a losing battle against physics, dumping thousands of rounds of tracers to create a blinding cage of light. But the Storm Shadow's brain is already ignoring the distractions. It's comparing the heat signature of the facility against its preloaded digital library with the processing speed of a high-end NVIDIA chip. The gunner tries to initiate a manual SAM launch, but the missile is moving at 500 knots, just 50 feet off the deck. By the time his brain processes the shape, the silent shadow has already banked around a grain elevator and locked onto its terminal coordinates. The missile didn't just hit the building. It performed a surgical audit of the boiler house. The Broach warhead, a 2-stage monster, punched through the reinforced concrete like it was wet cardboard. Then the Monroe effect kicked in. Imagine all that kinetic energy focused into a white-hot jet of plasma, injecting a localized thermal event directly into the turbine's heart. It didn't blow up the neighborhood. It structurally compromised the technical core so perfectly that the entire plant just stopped. But the real mic drop was Belgorod. The pilot of this Su-24 didn't even need to stay to see the result. He knew what he had just dropped had definitely hit its target. While the Russian commanders were frantically trying to figure out if their radars were lying to them again, 2 more silent shadows impacted the Luch TPP and the Storozhevaya substation. The result? An extensive disruption of the entire regional load. In a heartbeat, the Belgorod energy hub, the very nervous system of the region, experienced a total systemic failure. We are talking about a complete blackout of the primary distribution sector. Back in the Russian command bunkers, the screens finally cleared. The ghosts were gone. The operators thought they'd finally won. But as they sat there in the dark, shivering as the heaters died and the monitors went black, they realized the truth. They had protected the sky against decoys, while the real punch had already landed, unplugging their entire logistics rear. Russia spent tens of millions to scratch some paint in Lviv, while Ukraine used precision and silent shadows to freeze an entire regional hub. Now let's look at the aftershocks, because the physical impact on those power plants was just the opening act. When a major regional energy hub like Belgorod or Oriole goes dark at -5 degrees Fahrenheit, you aren't just looking at a power outage, you are witnessing the total systemic collapse of the Russian rear. We're talking about multi-billion-dollar infrastructure reduced to smoldering thermal events. Given the current sanctions, Moscow can't just order the parts to fix this. It's a permanent structural compromise that will take months, if not years, to even begin restoring. Just a few hours before this, the Kremlin was boasting about its unprecedented Oreshnik capability. They thought they were the ones intimidating the world. Fast forward to daybreak and the invincible shield is shattered. The myth of the impenetrable air defense was outsmarted by a surgical backdoor play. This engagement forces Moscow into a choice it can't win. They only have a limited number of high-value systems like the Panzer and S-400. Do they keep them at the front to protect their troops, or do they pull them back to protect their freezing infrastructure? So here is the lesson for the day. Don't spend tens of millions on a flashy Ferrari of a missile if you haven't secured your own backyard. Russia tried to demonstrate strength, but Ukraine demonstrated precision intelligence and a level of ROI that would make a Wall Street shark blush. If you support the smart underdog changing the rules of the game, smash that like button. And for the tech geeks in the comments, if you were the mission commander, which sector would you have suppressed first, Belgorod or Oriol? Let me know your tactical reasoning below. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the math of modern war. Bye for now.